Hello, I'm Paula Bolton, co-founder of Lesbian Labour. Welcome to our Proud Lesbian series. During Pride Month, I'll be interviewing a wide range of lesbians to gather lesbian perspectives and hear about lesbian lives in 2022. And my 20th interviewee leads a very interesting lesbian life. Stuck up in the middle of nowhere in the North Pennines, we're going to speak to 73-year-old Alice. Hello, Alice. Thank you for agreeing to share your stories.
Hi there, Paula.
Can we start where I started with everybody else? Tell us about your life as a lesbian. When did you discover you were a lesbian, etc.?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, really, because I didn't use the word. I didn't really sort of recognize. I mean, I knew they existed, but when I fell hopelessly in love with a girl at school when I was 13, I don't think, well, I might have vaguely thought of the word, but not really. And what I did do was that I looked at Dr. Spock, which was the childcare Bible of the time, which said that you get crushes in adolescence, but you grow out of it. And so I sort of went through that one. And then when she was older than me, and when she left the school, but a year after that, I went into sixth form, where I then fell for my very young, just out of college, new English teacher. And once again, I thought, oh, I don't know, you're going to grow out of this, you're going to grow out of this. And so I went to university, absolutely determined that I was going to lose my virginity, and that would stop me getting all this nonsense going, etc. Anyway, so I managed a few years of total nonsense, and then it was after I'd actually finished at university, but I was around, and the second ever GLF group, the first one outside London, started up in Lancaster, where I was, because two people, one who I'd known from before, a man, and one who had just arrived in the first year, had been involved with GLF in London that summer. So they started this, and I thought, oh. And then all the men that I'd been actual friends with all came out as gay. No great surprise, really, when I thought about it. There'd only been one who was out gay before, who was this completely wonderfully flamboyant West Indian guy called Ramsey, who was one of my favorite people on earth. Anyway, so we had a GLF group. And so I was sort of around it and sort of, not quite sure. But there was this woman who had arrived in the first year. It was a woman called Sue. And I thought she was gorgeous. Anyway, Quent, who was the bloke who had formed GLF with her, kept saying, oh, about time you got together with somebody. Mary really liked you. And I thought, oh, God, Mary, please. And I said, oh, I wish it was Sue. And he said, oh, I'm sure that can be arranged. And various things happened, in the course of which, this was over a period of 2 or 3 weeks, I was told that Sue did in fact fancy me, and she had been told that I fancied her.
Oh, this is like junior school, isn't it?
It is. But you see, the thing was, we ended up, but there was a party, and I was completely, I didn't know what to do. I thought, well, if she's really interested, she's the lesbian, she has to make the first move. Now, I heard this then from, there were 3 gay men who were in a sort of threesome at the time, and I was friends with them, and one of them was talking to Sue and one of them was talking to me. And so gradually I discovered that Sue was saying, well, if she's really interested, she'll have to do something, because I don't believe it. I'm not going to be seen as the predatory lesbian. Anyway, we finally made it that night, and very nice it was too, thank you. And so I spent, it wasn't that long a relationship, but it was bloody wonderful. And Gay Liberation Front was wonderful. I mean, yes, all the lesbians ended up leaving and getting involved with women's liberation instead. But, those early, very, very early days of gay liberation were fantastic. And, we'd go and give talks at other universities, and it was often me who would do it because I was willing to stand up on my hind legs and rabbit on. Yeah. And And it was great. Oh, and there was, you know, people always think about the miners, they think about 84, but there was this huge miners' strike in the early 70s. And and everyone knows about Pride and what happened there, blah, blah, blah. But actually, we did all that back in the early 70s. We did fantastic fundraising for a particular pit. And they were absolutely great. When the thing was over, they invited us all there and took us down. And it was hugely exciting. And they were fine about us. You know, we were all, you know, lesbians and gay men, and they didn't bat an eyelid. And I'm really sorry that story never got told, because it was, you know, it was 10 plus years earlier than the whole Pride one, you know.
Which area was the pit in? Just
somewhere around us. I mean, we were in Lancaster. I can't remember. Offhand. I've got a record somewhere where it was, but
a Lancashire pit. I'm just wondering. I imagine, you know, what they were trying to portray in the Pride film was, you know, a working class community being shocked by this difference, and how that doesn't actually portray the reality.
I think it was reasonably real from what I've gathered from people who were there at that particular Welsh pit, you know, and so on. But I was just astonished that this lot, and they might have been Yorkshire, who knows? I really cannot remember the name of the pit, but it was just so surprising. I was really nervous when we went over, thinking, "Oh, they're going to find us, all of it," and they didn't at all.
They didn't. Well, that's great. So, you said eventually you all, you know, all the women left. So where did you find your way to when you left the GLF then?
Oh, just women's liberation. I mean, and we, you know, there were all sorts of things going on. And I can't remember very clearly exactly what, because also I was doing weird things, because then I ended up with this woman who was decided to do the hill farming course at Newton Rig over near Penrith, which is only 20 miles from here. So we moved up to near Penrith. So I wasn't around a community as such any longer for that year. And then I lived in Upper Weardale for a while, all sorts of bits. And then I ended up in, well, the point is really, I went to Women's Week at Lauriston Hall, and which was just fantastic, you know, and it was all the sort of, all the women's stuff I'd been involved in already. It was just so great to do things politically with women and to be, you know, part of that whole sort of woman energy. And that Lauriston Women's Week was all like that, and it was great. And shortly after that, I'm not going to go through the detail because it's too awful, but these two ex-girlfriends who had got together and had a very, very ghastly relationship. I mean, horrible, horrible, violent relationship. And one of them had a working sheepdog who I had done a lambing with her at the place where the girlfriend used to live and work. And anyway, she appeared at my door one day and said, "Do you want the dog?" And now I'd often had the dog for a day or a weekend or something. And I said, you know, "How long for?" And she said, "Forever." And I knew why. The poor dog, with all this ghastly stuff going on between these two women, had started having fits. And the only time she was okay was when she was with me and I had one of her pups. And so I knew that was what it was all about. So, but once I had the dog, I had to get a job for her. It wasn't a job for me, it was a job for her. And I thought, well, things were great at Lauriston. You know, I'll ask them if I can go and stay there for a wee while I find a job. And that's what I did. And I found a job 6 miles up the road from Lauriston Hall.
I'm surprised to hear you talk about being in remote places already. I kind of think of that as a recent thing, and that's not the case, is it?
Not remotely recent, no. I did live in the countryside when I was a kid. I mean, not remote countryside, but we did holidays sometimes in remote places, which I always really liked. And then when I went shepherding, that was 1975 to 77, and I mean that that was a long way from anywhere. And of course, it was the days before mobile phones or anything like that.
Wow.
And, you know, it was 6 miles to the nearest phone box. There wasn't a landline at the place. And that was one of my absolute things. When I bought this place in 1982, I was looking for anyone. I was going to these estate agents and saying, I don't care whether it has mains electricity or not. I don't care whether it has, I certainly don't care if it has mains, water and drainage, though some water and drainage would be quite nice, but it must have a landline connection. And that's what I got. I got a place with a private water supply and septic tank and no electricity, but it did have a phone. So,
gosh. So I can't imagine there are that many shepherds around. How on earth did you come to choose to be that? And what was it like?
Well, I mean, I was doing it, as I said, because I had a dog who was a working dog. So I had known the dog when she and the woman that she'd belonged to were living in Wales with a woman who was working as a shepherd. And, you know, it wasn't that unusual, and it certainly isn't now. There's several more. But also, although women on their own as shepherds might have been less usual then, practically every so-called farmer's wife was actually a shepherd. And in fact, women were prized in shepherding because we tend to have smaller hands, which makes it better for doing lambing.
Right.
You know, if you do have to go in, you know, you don't want to be hurting the ewe while you're at it. You know.
Yeah. So in those couple of years, you must have done well. Was that your first lambing season, or had you done it elsewhere as well?
I think I mentioned that I'd had the dog for a lambing back in Wales, where her human had lived. So that was my first experience. It was an absolute baptism of fire. But the point was that I was working across 2 farms, small farms, but the people owning both of them really couldn't cope. They'd got too old to cope. So it was literally anything I did was better than nothing. And I learned a lot. And I don't think I made a total hash of it, not least because I had a very good working dog. You know, she was good. And she could catch me a ewe beautifully. You know, she was magnificent at it. So I'd done that lambing. And then when I got the job up in Scotland, it was what had happened was that I'd actually seen the place from the back of a minibus and thought, God, I'd love to live there. And then bizarrely, the job came up in, I can't remember, the local paper or Farmers Weekly or something. And I went to see the guy who wanted somebody. And when he took me over there, I could barely believe it was the same place. But I was saying to him, you know, oh, well, you know, I don't know much, and, you know, maybe it'll all be no good, and maybe the dog isn't good enough, and blah, blah, blah. And he said, you'll pick it up. Get another one. I mean, he was desperate because what had happened was that previously, shepherds and old guys, you know, retired from sort of shepherding a big place, would go and work somewhere like that, where you just needed to go round the sheep, 1,000 acres, you know, 400 sheep, a couple of times a week, but then very intensively at tuck time and vastly more intensively at lambing time. So, but it wasn't a full-time job except for those occasions. So these retired shepherds would go there because at that time you got no points at all for council housing when you had to leave a tied house. So they were totally stuck. But then just before I was there, it all changed and they started getting council housing points. So my boss was rather desperate, and even some stupid woman, you know, with some stupid dog was better than nothing. And the dog wasn't stupid, actually. His my boss's brother's shepherd, who was, I mean, really good and a really, really good dog handler, when he saw her work, he actually nearly cried. He said, if I'd had that dog when she was a pup, I wouldn't just have had a local champion. He'd had a lot of local champions. I'd have had a national champion. And you've ruined her. Which was the truth. I mean, you know, if she, you know, for her to be as good as she could have been, she would have had to have had a trainer like him. He wasn't being nasty at all, and he you know.
Yeah.
Anyway,
so I can't imagine that in that life, the fact of you being a lesbian or not had any, I don't think it would have mattered at all, would it? Or did you come across homophobia or lesbophobia?
Well, nobody knew anything about outside Lauriston Hall, and they were all, alternative types, so it wasn't an issue there.
Yeah.
So, but as I said, it was 80 miles to the nearest lesbian that I ever found, and so after sort of 2.25 years or something, I just decided I needed to go and do something else for a while. I'd intended to go back to shepherding because I loved it, but the gay man I knew who took over my job, he looked after the dog, and while he was training up his own, and she got poisoned, which was not his fault at all. I mean, it was horrific. It was horrific. Still distresses me after all these years, but anyway, that's what happened. So
did you move to a city then after that?
I went back to Lancaster for some time, and then I got involved with a woman who lived in London, and I was in London, and then I went down to my parents who were 25 miles south of London and got a job living at theirs and going up to London every weekend. And then just at the point that I actually got a job in London, she and I split up.
Oh.
Very convenient, wasn't it? But I'd signed a contract. So, and that was teaching. And so I was in London for a year, and then, what had happened was that I'd been working initially on supply teaching and then with a temporary contract when I was at my parents'. Actually, that's an interesting bit of the story in a way, because I was going up to London every weekend, and I was working in this place that was called a school for maladjusted adolescents, which you would never hear that term these days, but that was what was used then. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It was absolutely the perfect job for me. I loved working with those kids. Anyway, I was going up to London every weekend to see my girlfriend, and every Monday morning, we'd get into school. It's a very small place, but there were 2 teaching assistants and me and a part-time teacher and a bizarre head teacher. But these 2 lovely teaching assistants would sort of say, oh, this is what we did at the weekend. This is what we did at the weekend. What did you do, Alice? And I'd say, I went to see friends, plural, in London. And I can remember when I told my mother that, that was the difference. She said, I don't know why you have to go on about your sexuality. I thought, you say, my husband and I did this, we did that all the time. That's sort of normal. So.
Yeah, but not being, and somebody else said that they referred to using they in the old-fashioned way.
Yes.
Not revealing the sex of the person you're talking about. But so I mean, it's been there in the background. How were your family?
That was a total doddle. I mean, they were very sort of radical left-wingers at the time. They moved rightwards, not very far right, but and they'd been absolutely, for homosexual equality and all of that stuff. So when I first got involved with my first girlfriend, and I wrote to them, of course, you didn't have a phone in the house, and I wasn't going to use a public phone box for this, so I wrote to them. And I explained it totally in the context of, the sexism of, or what we then, as we then would call it, the male chauvinism all around me.
Yeah.
And therefore relationships with women seemed like a better bet. And when I wrote home, usually I get a reply from my mother with a little bit tagged on from my father at the end. This time the letter came back from my dad saying, infected though I am by male chauvinism, I understand what you mean. Have fun. And he'd always been great about things like this. My mother was a bit more uptight, not specifically about lesbianism or anything, but just she didn't quite know how to go out of the ordinary, although her politics was okay, but my dad was absolutely no problem whatsoever. Yeah. So that just wasn't an issue.
So were there any, obviously you mentioned a bit in school, but would you say you had any other instances where it's ever been an impediment in your working life or personal life?
Well, I mean, all through teaching, because then, you know, when I was in London, you know, it was an interesting school, shall we say, you know, a big school near the Elephant and Castle, you know, central London. And
can I ask what you taught?
Maths.
Okay.
And that was the thing, that was why I did all this teaching, because I wanted to continue being able to do stuff with troubled kids. So I'd spoken to the county advisor, who said, oh, but you haven't got enough mainstream teaching experience at secondary level. I got some experience at upper primary level. So you have to get 2 years secondary experience. What can you teach? And I thought, what can I teach? And he said, well, what did you do for A level? Oh, he said, first of all, so what's your degree? And I said, international politics. And he said, yeah, okay, that's a bit of a problem. What did you do for A level? I said, English, geography, and maths. And he said, maths, you've got an A level in maths. I said, yes, I didn't do very well at it, you know. He said, never mind, that'll be absolutely fine. Get a job teaching maths, they'll bite your hand off. And that's what I did for the next 2 years, first of all in London and then in Bradford. And by the time I'd done that, I never wanted to see the inside of a school ever again.
Yeah.
Absolutely hated it. And I'd loved that previous job so much. But anyway, that was what happened.
So where in terms of time, Alice, where was this in terms of Section 28? Was that anywhere to be seen yet?
Yeah, it was. I can't remember what year it all started.
1988 until 2000 it was in place.
Was it as late as 88 that Section 28 came in? Oh, well, that wasn't then what impacted when I was teaching, because that was, you know, in the late 70s and beginning of the 80s. But I mean, there had been a case in London of a man who had been, you know, the kids had been going on and on and on and on and on at him about, you know, are you gay, sir? Are you gay? You know, and eventually he'd say, yeah, I'm gay. Is that a problem? And he got sacked. And I got a lot of that at this school, you know. Have you got a boyfriend, miss? Are you married? You know, etc., etc. No. And I refused to be actively dishonest with them, but I avoided everything I could. They drew their own conclusions, and there was a couple of occasions. It was particularly when in the summer term, when the what was then still O-level and CSE kids had done their exams, when you often got and the teacher, there was all sorts of things going on, and the teachers would be doing other things and taking them on trips and so on. So I'd end up having to teach kids that I hadn't taught before, you know, just basically babysit them. So they didn't know me. And on a couple of occasions, I would go into a classroom and there were girls would run back, get away from her, get to the back of the room. Jesus, wept, you know. That was really bad, that summer term in London. It was really, really bad. And I confess that in the end, I used to end up going out drinking at lunchtime with Pauline, who taught in the same department, who knew I was a lesbian and wasn't a problem to her.
Yeah.
So I would come back and deal with afternoon school slightly cut. But it was the way of getting through it, you know. I mean, I don't feel proud of that, but it was how I dealt with it.
Well, gosh. So being in London, I imagine there was some kind of scene, was there a lesbian social life to be tapped into, and did you tap into it?
Oh, while I was in London, yes, and in Bradford. I mean, I ended up with a girlfriend in Bradford. I mean, in London, you know, there were the lesbian discos and, you know, all sorts of stuff going on. I didn't get heavily involved, but I was living in, you know, a lesbian squat, and, you know, I was very much part of all of that, not so much scene, but, you know, just community. And in Bradford, we had, well, it was a women's group, but it was like 2/3 lesbians. And, you know, we had a sort of an official, if you like, meeting once a week, but we'd met at other times too. And my girlfriend and I, you know, did all sorts of things. That was also the great time when I got arrested for picketing a cinema where they were showing one of those completely, because this was still the time of the Ripper when I was in Bradford. And one of the really horrific films that was doing the rounds, and it was just so irresponsible of anyone to show this film. Anyway, there was a whole huge group of us on the steps of this cinema.
Was it Gas to Kill?
No, it wasn't. That was the one that they did in Leeds. This was a different one. At the moment, I can't remember what it was called. Right. But anyway, there were, I don't know, maybe sort of 40 of us on the steps, and the police arrived. And they said, "So who's in charge here? Who's the ringleader?" And of course, everyone just laughed themselves silly. In the end, the police bloke in charge turned to his minions and said, "Okay, get her, and her." And I was one of them. And they took us to the police station and eventually charged us with something or another. They let us out at 1, 2 in the morning, in the middle of Bradford during the time of the Ripper. And we said, "Come on, we were with our mates. We knew how to get home. We had company, we were safe. And now you're turfing us out." And we've all lived in different directions. Mm. And they said, "Girls who play with fire must expect to get burnt."
Right. So given that anybody might watch this, can you just explain what the Ripper was? I know what it was.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
There was a whole series of murders, which it took the police a bit of time to even connect together properly. They were across, I think there was at least 1 or 2 in Manchester, and then in Bradford and in Leeds. And I think it was it Halifax? I can't remember. There was somewhere else anyway. It was realised that it was the same bloke because the method was the same. And there were a couple of women who did get away, having been battered on the back of the head, and they were really quite seriously injured. And the police were complete idiots and messed the whole thing up massively, partly because they were completely certain that every woman who had been murdered was a prostituted woman and therefore somehow didn't quite count. And then when they got on to the innocent victims, so-called, you can't imagine how angry we all felt. I mean, I knew quite a lot of the prostituted women in Bradford, in fact, at this time. And just the whole sort of attitude. So they were contemptuous, they weren't bothered. Some bloke pretended that he was the Ripper because he got that name from what a past thingy, a historic thing of chapter. Yeah. And the whole sort of con that was done by this other bloke, the survivors said he quite definitely had a Yorkshire accent, and somebody with a northeast accent said, I think it was a northeast accent, came in, sent this tape in claiming to be the Ripper and so on and so forth. So they took vastly longer than they should have done to catch him, and many more murders than it was really bad. Everyone was, you were frightened all the time. You never went anywhere with that on your own. You just didn't do it.
So was that the beginnings of the Reclaim the Night stuff?
I don't know. I thought Reclaim the Night started in London.
Yeah, it may well have. I just wondered whether there was kind of in much the way there was the reaction to Sarah Everard, whether there was an autonomous response in different parts of the country from women.
Yes, I mean there was, but for us it was doing things like the cinema demo, and other things were going on in Leeds. The women in Leeds did a lot of stuff too.
Yeah. So I want to bring you on here to lesbian only spaces, women only spaces. Does it matter to you? Is it important?
Vastly important. I mean, first of all, women only spaces, absolutely critical. I mean, it was when I first had the chance in Lancaster, fairly early on, to be in women only groups and, consciousness raising groups. I mean, it's just a different universe. It doesn't matter how nice the men are. There's a totally different energy from being in a women only space. And a lesbian only space, I don't know how much I thought that back in the 70s, but now I'm part of a women's group that meets up for a weekend 3 times a year, and it's a lesbian space. It wasn't even set up like that, but that's what it turned out to be. And you know, that lesbian space really matters to me. But in terms of, you know, I mean, the lesbian discos in London were great, but they weren't actually lesbian only, because other women did come to them. And I can't remember what else, but because I spent so much of my life in out of the way places, you know, there were no lesbian spaces there, I can tell you.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, to just contrasted your life, which you know, in rural, let's just say a rural isolation, as opposed to somebody in a city. Now, the exact opposite end to this for me would be one of the women who was an electrician in the States, and she spent her working life amongst men the whole time. And for her, she needed to be able to go somewhere where there were women to counteract that other energy, you know, that she was constantly around. The you know, the misogyny and just male energy. So to be with women as a woman who loves women was very important to her. For you, not actually having anybody around, let alone
well, but that's not quite true, because when I was in Scotland, yes, there weren't other lesbians around, but there was quite a strong sort of women's community at Lauriston Hall, although they were all heterosexual at the time. And the women did things together, and I did things with them. And then once I was here, you know, I moved here with another woman. We did split up, but then I was living here with someone else. And actually, at that point, for a community of 2,000 people spread over quite a big area, there were a surprising number of lesbians around.
Oh, right, okay. Well, you've probably got more than I have then.
Well, there were I think there was a point where there were 10 of us. And you know, it was great. And also at that time there was Carlisle Women's Group, which had some lesbians in, but we had a women's group here. I mean, from when I first arrived, a women's group which mostly wasn't lesbians, but you know, were very, you know, good feminist women, you know. So that was very distinctly women only. We did some great things together, you know. So I had all that.
I think sometimes there can be a lot gained from the community of place where you are, if you've got good relationships with your neighbours. And at the end of the day, we don't need masses, do we? We just need some. So if you've got a good consciousness raising group and, you know, a dozen around, then you'll be all right.
Yes. I mean, I've never really had, I mean, now there are probably fewer women in the conscious sense of a women's group, because one of the women moved away. I mean, one of the important, I mean, heterosexual woman, but very, you know, solid. She moved away, and other things happened. It's a long story. But, you know, in a sense, I have less in terms of you know, female contact now than I did 20 odd years ago. But at the same time, of course, now we have this means of communication through Zoom, and so you know, and I'm involved with a whole lot of things that once upon a time I couldn't possibly have been involved in, because they would all have been happening in cities. So now I do everything on this, and
which is
occasionally.
So talk to me a bit about representation, Alice, in films and books, art and music. You know, how much does it matter to you to be able to pick up a book and find a lesbian character, or, you know, lesbian poetry, whatever?
Well, of course it matters, but I think it matters more to some people than it does to me. I don't mean it doesn't matter. I love it when I find that sort of thing. But, you know, it can also be a bit of a downer at times, you know. I mean, as others have remarked, the lesbians always seem to get killed off, don't they? I remember watching.
Everybody says that.
Yes, last time going Halifax. Yeah. Oh, yay!
Yes, hooray!
Relationship, and then that's her gone, and such like. And one of the first things I ever came across was way back, and it was pure chance, because I was completely mad about plays, drama, and I bought secondhand a copy of best plays of 1930, whatever it was, which included Lillian Hellman's The Children's Hour, which has since, I think, been made into a film, but is that it's based on a true story about these two women who were lesbians, as far as anyone knows, but basically got reported by some kid that they taught who made their life hell and so on. So I remember reading that and thinking, I don't want my life to be like that, you know. Although it's a good play, you know. But
well, I think that's my point about representation, because if we bring ourselves into the 2022 frame at the moment, imagining that you're a young woman coming out now, or wondering if you are same-sex attracted, what will you find in terms of representation? You know,
it's worse even than that, really, because so many of the things that we had are gone. I mean, I used to, you know, there was Spare Rib when Spare Rib was really something. There was Trouble and Strife, which was a fantastic resource. And then I used to get from the States Country Women, which was brilliant. And so there was a lot that I could connect into, and it doesn't exist now. You know, there just isn't that sort of sense of things other than online. And I wish it was other than online, but, you know, I mean, I'm not disparaging this medium, but it's a bit, it has its problems, shall we say.
Yeah. So do you you know, obviously we've kind of done quite a bit on your working life, but I do happen to know that you also do some counselling, don't you?
Oh, well, I that was the latter part of my working life. I trained as a psychotherapist. Before that, I was working in countryside management for most of the time, from when I came here for the first 10, 11, 15 something years. I can't remember exactly how long it went. Oh, yeah, it must have been about 15 years. But then I was teaching heritage management, particularly in terms of natural heritage, at on a degree course in Carlisle. But it all gets a bit I trained as a homeopath. I was never particularly good as a homeopath, and then I started training as a psychotherapist, and that's what I did for until I retired, whenever that was, 2016 or something. And I now do some volunteer counselling at the local school. Just, you know, I didn't train to work with kids, but they've got nobody and they can't afford to get somebody, so me as a volunteer is better than nought.
So actually you are very much in the right place to talk a little bit about, again, let's take that youngster coming out who reaches out for some support from a counsellor or a psychotherapist. If somebody's got questions about their sexual orientation, what's that environment like nowadays?
Well, I have to be honest, I'm glad that I am no longer working professionally as a psychotherapist, because since I retired, my own registration organisation, UK Council for Psychotherapy, along with all the others, signed up to the Memorandum of Understanding version 2, which basically tells you that you have to affirm any kid who comes in and says they're trans. And in terms of being lesbian or gay, it doesn't actually, I mean, it started out as quite a good solid statement about supporting lesbian and gay kids and not making their life hell, but it's been so overtaken by the inclusion now of gender identity and trans stuff. So I'm glad that isn't there. But I mean, I'm sure you know that the sort of bullying and nastiness, the homophobia and lesbophobia in schools now is horrific. I mean, it's worse than it ever was. And I'm really not surprised that kids decide they'd rather transition than cope with that. You know, I mean, I heard a dreadful story the other day, which I'm going to have to make very vague for confidentiality reasons, but of a kid who announced in school that she was a lesbian, and one of the boys in the class basically told her that she needed to be raped.
Yeah.
And, you know, and she then went on to try to kill herself. And I mean, luckily she did not succeed. But, you know, these things are just dreadful. And, you know, just I mean, I know about it in the school where I'm doing the counselling at the moment. You know, it's bad. I mean, I have kids who clearly do understand the whole thing, and who talk to me about how upset they are by the homophobia and lesbophobia, but they don't feel able to counter it.
Yeah. Do you, you know, are you involved in any activism around this at all?
Well, just here and there. I'm involved with Labour Women's Declaration and the LGB Alliance, and I do things for both of them. I mean, in terms of Labour Women's Declaration, I'll be honest, if I wasn't involved with that group, I wouldn't be in Labour anymore, because they are appalling. But I love working with that group. And the LGB Alliance has been an absolute breath of fresh air, you know, going back to how life used to be with Gay Liberation Front, really, and before Stonewall became a trans organisation and so on. So yes, that's really where my political activity directly is these days. But you know, I do all sorts of bits and pieces.
So, in a couple of sentences, what's the political message behind LGB Alliance? What are they fighting for?
The recognition of same-sex attraction as opposed to same-gender attraction, which is what Stonewall has turned it into, with the emphasis on gender identity and trans, which means that if a male person decides that they are really a woman, that you as a lesbian should include them in your dating pool, as they say. And I mean, it's just hell on wheels, and that's one of the reasons that, you know, young lesbians in particular are deciding to transition, and it's completely tragic. I mean, it just breaks my heart. I mean, it's not only young lesbians who are in this position. I don't want to make out that every single kid who decides to transition is lesbian or gay, but a lot of them are. And you know, it's like it's been forgotten that there is still, or again worse, you know, homophobia, lesbophobia, and there is no decent support stuff for young lesbians and gay men now. And that's one of the things that LGB Alliance is aiming to provide. And I just think it's crucial that we have a voice that actually recognises what's going on, that can speak up for it, you know, nationally, internationally, you know. Well,
being devil's advocate here, surely Stonewall is the recognised national and international spokesgroup for all things LGBT, so surely they speak for lesbians. And
like hell they do. They don't at all, because first of all, adding the T into the LGB, I mean, it's just weird, isn't it? One moment you're talking about sexual orientation and, you know, your private life, essentially. I mean, you can be as loud about it as you like, but essentially you're talking about your relationships and what most people would regard as a private life. And then you bung the T plus now, you know, the QIA plus whatever, which are all entirely different things. And you know, that what actually is important for the LG and B seems to have gone out the window, not least, as I said, this idea that it's gender that matters. And so you are same gender attracted, which means same gender identity attracted, and not same sex attracted. Well, I'm sorry, but I'm not attracted to anyone who isn't female, brought up female, knows themselves female. You know what I mean? It's a completely crucial part of it. And Stonewall ditched most of that in 2015. So,
right, okay. So, in terms of LWD, what's that about then?
Well, trying to work to convince the Labour Party that all of this matters, and that moving into a thing where you decide that what matters is not sex but gender identity, which they have done in various ways, means that women are losing out. I mean, it breaks my heart. You know, Labour was the party that actually got its act together to create all women shortlists and to have women's officers in every single CLP, community constituency Labour Party, up and down the country, you know, way back in the 80s. And they did this because they understood that women suffered disadvantage and discrimination across the board. And so there was things like the Equal Pay Act, which had come in, you know, I think that was Barbara Castle, wasn't it? You know, all of those things that I had really thought Labour stood for are being overturned. And they, you know, they said that apparently, I mean, this is after I joined Labour, I was a women's officer in my constituency, and I took a motion when the first young man who had declared himself a woman became a women's officer. I mean, it was quite a blow, you know, to everything that I'd understood, but it was being challenged within Labour, and I just took a motion asking, you know, from the constituency that Labour should consider women's viewpoint on this before making a final decision. And at the meeting where I put the motion, I was basically told I was a transphobe, that I was on the wrong side of history, that I was bringing the constituency into disrepute, etc. So really that was the end of my involvement with the local constituency Labour Party. And, you know, in Labour now, you know, there was this ridiculous business about, can a woman have a penis? I mean, give me strength. And can a man have a cervix? You know, there are some things that you have to understand in order to understand discrimination against women, you know, and the first point is the difference between men and women, the fact that they are discrete sexes, and that's how the world works. And if you can't even get that far, how do you deal with sexism? I mean, it's just not possible. So that's what Labour Women's Declaration is really trying to do, is to try and get through to the party that these things matter. This does not mean that we want to discriminate against trans people. It does not mean that we want them to cease to exist or anything of the sort, quite the opposite. I want really, really good legislation and cultural change so that people can be totally non-conforming to the sex stereotypes that are expected of them. And you know, there should be good provision for people of all sorts, but not at the expense of women's provision.
Yeah. So what would you be saying to, if we did manage to get Keir Starmer here in the room, what would you be wanting to say to him, Alice? How do we make sure that the Labour Party is the party for women and gets the votes? Because I have to say, out of 19 previous interviewees, everyone's a floating voter.
Yeah, well, if I were to say I'm a floating voter, I would be chucked out of Labour, wouldn't I? So I think I'll just stay silent on that one. I mean, I don't know what one says to Keir Starmer. I mean, you know, we have worked from all sorts of angles and through all sorts of people and in all sorts of directions to try and make things clear. So I'm not sure what can be said to Keir Starmer that he can even listen to. But what I want to say is, you know, please remember the history of the Labour Party. Remember what you were proud of. Remember what has actually, you know, mattered within Labour, and why so many women did join Labour and voted Labour. And it was because you understood about women's liberation and all the things around that. It wasn't just equal pay, it wasn't just sex discrimination, it was the whole thing. It was about, you know, domestic abuse. It was, I mean, you know, all these things that I thought Labour still stood for, but they don't. Mm-hmm. But I find it hard to believe that none of the MPs, well, almost none of the MPs now, are proud of that history and want to be the bearers of it into the future, but they seem not.
So, I mean, why is this all happening? I mean, I'm thinking particularly as well about, you alluded to the ever-growing acronym. Mm-hmm. Who are the acronym police? How does that happen?
I really do wish I totally understood it, and I don't claim to. I think it's the acceptance in big organisations and small organisations for that matter that really distresses me. I think there's several things. Firstly, I think, you know, feminism, I mean proper feminism, you know, women's liberation, second wave feminism, that sort of thing, not the thing that passes for feminism these days. well, you know, that really does distress me when you think that pole dancing is somehow personal liberation and therefore feminism. But anyway, you know, I think there was a big backlash against women's liberation from particularly the sort of 90s, because they've gone too far now, you know, that sort of attitude. And I remember there was always this thing about they didn't like having women in the boardroom because they spoke too much, apparently. And then someone did some actual research and measured how long different people spoke for in a number of them, and discovered that the men spoke 2/3 of the time as a minimum. When the women spoke as much as 1/3 of the time, the men experienced it as the women taking over the whole meeting.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think the backlash was that they wanted to get women in their place. So I think that's an element of it. I think there's also something about how when all the trans stuff sort of started really making inroads, I mean, it's been around a very long time, but when it really started making inroads, I think a lot of people who had been against, you know, gay and lesbian people being able to get married, I mean, whatever next, you know, those sort of people who then discovered they were on the wrong side of history were very desperate not to be on the wrong side again, and they thought this was just a continuation of it, and it gets sold as that, you know. They thought, oh well, we better be absolutely for this, and yes, gender neutral toilets, and you know, blah 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 blah, all the rest of the garbage. But there has to be money in it somewhere. I mean, obviously is money in it somewhere. And I mean, I have to say, Simon Edge's book, The End of the World is Flat, I suspect, which is basically a sort of satire, taking a completely different subject, but basically looking at what happens to an organisation that's been a very successful campaigning organisation when it's achieved what it set out to do. You know, what does it do next? And in his book, they go completely against everything that they'd ever done because they get a lot of money from a big thingy, and that meant that people could keep their jobs in the organisation and so on and so forth. And I'm sure, I don't think it's quite as straightforward as what Simon Edge has done in the book, but I still think it's not bad. And some of the things he talks about in that book about how they achieved it through Twitter bots and things, I'm absolutely certain he's right.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the interviews was with a 28-year-old from Canada who came out into a much further down the road, you know, queer community, and there it apparently was an absolute top-down thing. So you know, this collusion between top-down and ideology in universities, at what level that affects your average bod on the street, you know, that's what always interests me, because I you know, ask people these questions just as a matter of course in conversation, and asking them makes me look like a loony. You know, because there are still huge swathes of the population for whom this means nothing, and biology is biology, and they know which way is up. So I still don't know who gets to decide that. I get all of that, you know, those suggestions you've made, but I mean, I didn't get the memo to say that we have decided to add T, and from now on your sexual orientation based work will no longer just be that. Nobody told me, nobody asked me, nobody asked the trade union members at the Unison conference. You know, these things are being imposed without any consultation, and I don't know if there's anything that can be done about that.
There's something very interesting about cultural movements, you know, and how they take over. And I don't profess to have expertise in this, but it's not, I don't think it's ever really top down. It's the top thinking that they're going to avoid criticism if they do this, you know. It's all very complicated, but I mean, more and more people are being directly affected. I mean, I don't know if you heard earlier today, Westminster Hall debate about, you know,
schooling.
Yeah, about sex education in schools. And Miriam Cates was just completely brilliant. And she laid out a lot of the things that are happening in schools that parents are very concerned about, rightly. You know, parents I mean, I've heard some of these stories, you know, where a boy, you know, an 8-year-old boy comes home from school distraught And his parents are saying, what's the matter? What's the matter? And eventually he said, I might turn into a girl, and, people are having to deal with that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Aren't going to be neutral about all of this, even if it takes them some time to realize the whole spread of it all. But then it's also, when your elderly mother is, in a care home and her intimate care is done by someone who is quite obviously a man, although it's claimed to be a woman, and you're in a hospital ward and there's someone who's obviously a man opposite you, and so on. I mean, these things are increasingly becoming obvious to more and more people,
The thing that struck me very much about Miriam's speech today was her opening thing, where she said, this is not suitable for children.
Yes.
My speech is not suitable for children. And I'm talking to you about the resources that they have already seen.
Yeah.
I mean, it is ridiculous. But yeah, there are people getting on this and hopefully, beginning to take some action. And it will be in no small part due to the efforts of folk like yourself, Alice, a very proud lesbian. So thank you for the work that you do. Was there anything else, any other area of activism that you wanted to talk about before we finish?
Can't think of anything off the top of my head. I'll probably think of it all, after we've ended.
Yes.
I mean, I suppose really what I do want to say is that, all that I did through the 70s and 80s, in big and small ways, was just so important. I mean, that was and is my whole life, is that issue of women's liberation, and it made sense of the world to me, and it has been the most important thing. And to see how much of it has been dismantled and is threatened, just, I can't stop while all the work that I and so many other women did and are still doing is being wrecked.
Yeah,
I can't rest. So I shall still be, I'll be lying on my deathbed, with some instruction to someone, you've got to go right to so-and-so.
Well, when we are only 1 week beyond the Roe v. Wade being overturned, it's no rest. There is no rest yet, is there? This is
absolutely. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think there ever will be, because I actually, while back in the 70s, I sort of imagined that by now we'd be in the sunlit uplands, and everything would be, totally changed. The whole of society would be transformed. Well, bloody ha.
Yeah.
And in fact, what I now feel is that this is in fact never ending, that, there will always be another way that they try and get women put in their place. And the point of working our socks off about whatever the latest thing is for the networks we build among women, the support we provide for women, the love that is created among women. And that's what matters.
Absolutely. And that's a lovely place to finish. So thank you very much, Alice.
Thank you, Paula.